Hello everyone and welcome to our third lecture here in chapter 16. In this lecture we're going to take a look at our other important major Mesoamerican culture, and we're going to take a look at the Aztecs. So let's get started. Alright, so before we can actually talk about the Aztecs themselves, we actually need to talk about the geography of where they're going to live, or what's going to become their main area of focus and where they're going to settle down. And that's the Valley of Mexico. In the Valley of Mexico, in this area, it's very mountainous and it's very high above sea level. But even though you have this area that's very mountainous and high above sea level, there's this valley that runs down the middle of Central America. And there are some large lakes that exist in the center of this valley, but they're very shallow. And that's going to become important later on when we talk about the role that these lakes are going to play in Aztec civilization. And then also, this area is fairly protected, and there's high amounts of accessible resources in this valley. Whether it's the water, whether it's resources as well, there's very fertile soil. All of these factors, these resources, protection, all this kind of stuff makes it a very attractive area for people to come to and to develop a civilization. All right, so again, before we talk about the Aztecs, we actually need to talk about a major civilization that existed before them here, roughly in the same place. And that is the first major city in Central America of Teotihuacan. And Teotihuacan at its height is believed to roughly have about 200,000 people. From the ruins and stuff that have been excavated and still exist there to this day, there's over 20 pyramids that are dedicated to different gods in this place. The housing they found, that was kind of like an apartment block style housing for the people, so people live very close together. And one thing we do know is that Teotihuacan at its height was this trade center for Central America. And they used obsidian specifically for weaponry. If you guys don't know what obsidian is, you can see an arrowhead of it here. That's the actual molten, so when volcanoes erupt, and then it hardens, that's the rock that comes out of it. And it can be very, very sharp, and it's a very good tool and weapon. So Teotihuacan, they come to conquer much of Mesoamerica and provide their influence over this entire region. Now, unfortunately for them, their city is going to be abandoned around 750 CE or AD, depending on which one you want to follow. It's still the same year. And it's mysterious. We don't know exactly why that is. Some people think it's kind of similar to what happened to the Maya city-states and why they declined a few centuries later, but they don't exactly know why. All right, so another group of people we have to talk about that existed in this region as well before we get to the Aztecs, are the Toltecs. And the Toltecs kind of come into Central America and rise to power in the vacuum that's left over when Teotihuacan falls. And their capital was known as Tula, and they're a warlike people. And they centered on this aspect of conquest. They liked warfare, they liked to build land. And one thing they did with that to show off power and respect to the gods was they also practiced human sacrifice. So this is a common theme among many of the Central or Mesoamerican cultures we've talked about, whether it's the Maya, the Toltecs, or the Aztecs as we move forward. Now, after the year 1000, Toltecs, their leader, tries to follow the god Quetzalcoatl, or the feathered serpent god. Now, what ultimately ends up happening is the warriors revolt against him, and he is exiled. And what will happen in the upcoming decades and years is that the Toltecs are going to go into decline, and by the early 1200s, they completely lose power in this region. Now, the reason why I bring up the warrior revolt, when Toltecs changes fellowship in religion to Quetzalcoatl, it's because of the role that Quetzalcoatl is going to play later in the role of the decline of the Aztecs, or at least the representation of them. All right, so now we can move on to the Aztecs themselves. The Aztecs actually were a nomadic people from what we call northern Mexico today, and they entered the Mexican Valley, or Valley of Mexico, in about the year 1200. And as they come into contact with people, they start to adapt adapt to their cultures and mix with what they do and so forth, and begin actually working as mercenaries. Um, Now, on page 454 of your textbook, there's a short little story about it talks about where the Aztecs would found their own city or their capital city, which will be known as Tenochtitlan on Lake Texcoco, which you guys can see here. And this is Huitzilopochtli, their god of the sun. But basically, the idea is that Huitzilopochtli tells the Aztec leader Tenoch that if you go searching for a place and you find high up in the mountains, if you find this, um, you'll find this lake in this valley, and in the center of the lake, you're going to see a island, and on that island will be a cactus with an eagle, eagle sitting on the cactus eating a snake or having a snake in its mouth, and that's where you're going to find your capital city, and that's the legend. And if you guys think this sounds familiar in terms of imagery, go look at the flag of Mexico today. That is exactly what's on the middle of the flag, middle of the Mexican flag, is that representation of the eagle on a cactus and an island in the middle of the lake. Here you guys can see this is a representation of just kind of a way of what Tenochtitlan looked like. It's an island in the middle of the lake. You've got causeways running to it and other islands as well, just on the outside. Now let's talk about Aztec power here. The Aztecs grew to be quite substantial, but after a couple hundred years, they actually were running into other groups of people. They were expanding, and there were two other powerful groups around them, the Texcoco and the Tlacopan. Well, they form an alliance in 1428 with these two other tribes, and it's called the Triple Alliance. And for those of you who are looking stuff up, this is not the Triple Alliance that's going to exist during World War I. Okay? Just make sure that you understand there's a difference, even though they have the same name. Now, that'll be important because not only it brings them more power, better relationships with people around them, but it's going to allow them to expand a lot more. Now, by the early 1500s, the empire is going to grow to stretch nearly 80,000 square kilometers in Central America, and it's going to contain anywhere from 5 to 15 million people. I know it's a wide range, but still, that's a lot of people in this area of the world. And their power is going to be based on two things. It's going to be based on military conquest and tribute. In a lot of ways, it's similar to that power that was built by the Mongols. Now, the Mongols are going to treat people after they take control of them a lot better than the Aztecs, which is going to be why the Aztecs are going to struggle or have some struggles later on. But basically what they did, and this is a benefit of a lot of cultures, again, like the Mongols and the Muslim forces we've talked about before, they often did allow local rulers to just rule and maintain their power as long as they either paid tribute or operated within the system. Okay, that's a good thing. The bad thing is they brutally put down resistance over time to the point where the tactics they would use, and we're going to get into a couple of them a little bit later here, that it would actually anger people, and that vengeance and revenge that these people would have would come back to hurt the Aztecs later down the line. Now, initially, it's not a bad thing because it showed off, hey, look, we mean business and we're here to control, and it staunched, other things, or kept things from going. Excuse me. All right, so the society of the Aztecs is very similar to pretty much all the other societies we've talked about, especially in this chapter. You have the royalty at the top. You have a noble class that is primarily your upper government officials, your religious figures, and your military leaders. And they ruled as lords of estates. Again, not unlike the feudal system that we saw in Europe. Now, everybody else was underneath, and they weren't divided into other classes. So like in the Maya case, we saw that they were divided into other classes. In this case, they're not in the Aztec one. Merchants, artisans, farmers, soldiers, slaves, they're all pretty much in the same class, with slaves being, at the very bottom. Now, merchants, even though they were in the class with commoners, they were a little bit more elite because they could travel and they would act as spies. They could gain their own wealth and so forth, but other people could as well. But you could own land as a commoner, which is still a benefit. All right, so now a little bit more about Tenochtitlan. So by the time the Spanish arrived, or just before that, Tenochtitlan was roughly the size of 200 to 400,000 people. That's a massive city. That's a huge city even to this day, especially considering that it's on an island in the middle of a lake. Now, Tenochtitlan was connected to the mainland by three causeways. And causeways, you guys will learn about what those are in the Engineering an Empire video, but they're just basically built up built up roads crossing water to an island. And it allows the city to connect to the rest of the empire. And from there, what the Aztecs are able to do is they build a significant organized road system to connect Tenochtitlan to the rest of the empire. Think of the idea that like all roads lead to Rome when we talk about the Roman Empire. Same thing here. All roads lead to Tenochtitlan in the Aztec Empire. Now, their market was Tlatelolco, and they traded all the goods from the empire. Everything would come there, or they'd trade them out. And that was an extensive market, which brought not only new goods and experiences in contact with new goods and things like that, but also money and supplies. Now, primarily, Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire, how did they feed so many people, specifically in such a small area with Tenochtitlan? Well, they built chinampas. And if you guys remember in the last section with the Maya, we talked about how they used farming techniques of raised farm beds. That's kind of similar to what we're going to be talking about here. Is chinampas were raised land on marshes. And in the video, you guys are going to see how they actually kind of make them. But basically what they would do is they would just kind of make these matted areas, post things down and anchor it, and they could actually create farmland over the water. So you could extend out the area that you could actually, that you could plant on. And that led to a lot of food and allowed the city to sustain itself. Now at the very center of the city, you had temples, you had government buildings, and you had a rich complex to show off the power of the Aztecs, whether it was religious or political. And they had the Great Temple in the very middle, which was a temple to the sun and the rain gods. Here, guys, you can actually see pictures of chinampas here. You can see they actually have waterways, water pathways or water roads that you can use to travel between them. And you can see they use these trees as kind of anchor posts. But this is farmland that's sitting on top of this marshy, swampy area. And this allows for them to build the farms outwards, or build areas outwards to farm. Now, let's talk about the religion here. So the religion of the Aztecs is obviously polytheistic. They worshipped roughly 1,000 gods, different gods. And what they did is they adopted many of their gods from other cultures. Remember, they're nomadic groups. They're coming into contact with others in Central America. And they practiced very elaborate public ceremonies to try to win the favor of these gods at various times of the year. They would put offerings up in terms of, gifts of tribute. They would do make dances, sing songs. There were plays that were even made for not only for entertainment of the people, but to please the gods as well. And they even developed a calendar that included these festivals to make sure that people knew when these gods were being offered and all this kind of stuff. Their religion was very important to them. And they, again, just like with the Maya and the other Native American cultures we're talking about here, these gods are representative of nature in some form, whether it's the sun, wind, rain, whatever. Now, this is the next thing that we need to talk about with the Aztecs. Now, they're not the only culture that we talked about that practices human sacrifice. We mentioned it a little bit earlier with the Toltecs, and we mentioned it last section with the Maya. But I didn't go into too much detail. Now, in the Aztecs, they took it to a whole new level. They viewed that their most important god, Huitzilopochtli, who has a connection with their founding, back with the story of where they founded Tenochtitlan. They viewed him as the most important god. And he had to have the most important rituals. And the reason why Huitzilopochtli was the most important god, in being the sun god, is that he made the sun rise every day. And with the sun rising meant that evil was defeated, at least for that day. Because remember, it's that idea of light versus dark. Okay? The sun versus night. Or the sun versus the moon. And This is a key idea, and the Aztecs were afraid that if they didn't pay respect to Huitzilopochtli appropriately, eventually the sun would just not come back. And so what they did is they practiced human sacrifice to give that blood debt, to give him the strength to fight and fight off the darkness. And what they typically would do is their victims would be slaves, criminals that met a certain level, people that would actually offer even tribute, they'd give up their lives, and prisoners of war. Now, the prisoners of war became their main source of human sacrifice because you didn't want to kill your own people because that could hurt your society overall. Now, here's the problem with that. Over time, if you guys remember, I said that their practice of putting down brutal revolts and doing all this other stuff, when you combine it with these sacrifices, that's going to anger the people that they control. And when there's another group that comes in or they start to falter, they're going to turn on the Aztecs. This kind of leads me to our very last slide here outside of that painting, the problems the Aztecs are going to face. So one thing that happens is in 1502, the Aztecs lose a pretty successful emperor, and it's going to be replaced by one that's not so great. Montezuma II is going to be crowned emperor. And ultimately what happens is he's not the most effective ruler, and certain provinces start to rebel against him and the Aztec rule, primarily because of the high amounts of tribute that they've had to pay for quite some time, and then, just like what I said in the last slide, the amounts of human sacrifice, the blood that they were paying. They didn't like it. Now he starts to issue reforms. They fail. Most of them fail. Some are mildly successful. But what's going on is in this time you have rebellion. He's trying to reform. And there's all these bad omens that link to religious signs and stories and angering of the gods that the Aztecs believe in. For example, the Great Temple gets struck by lightning and is highly damaged. But also what happens is the greatest threat to the Aztec power is going to arrive roughly at this time, and it's the Spanish. And this is believed to be the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, which at first is viewed as a good thing, but then over time it's viewed as something terrible. And the Spanish, although they're small in number, they bring a few things that ultimately are going to lead to the demise of the Aztecs. One, they bring horses. This isn't necessarily leading to their demise, but it's the introduction of a new animal. Number two is they bring guns. So gunpowder weapons. That's going to hurt them. They have, and then the most important thing, because they're going to be coming in small number, but they're going to be bringing something that's going to punch way above their weight. And that's, they bring disease. Disease that the Aztecs don't have really any defenses for. And here, guys, this is a famous painting. You can see of Cortez's conquest of Mexico. You can see the Spanish forces going across the causeways here to go to the Great Temple and defeat the Aztecs. All right, guys, that's all I got for you in this lecture. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.